Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the battings that I use in my quilts. I often get asked what sort of batting I use, so I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about it. I'm not going to give you any of the technical stuff behind it. It's really just a practical what I'm using. So I use pretty much three types of batting. I use synthetic batting, I use cotton or a cotton poly blend, and I use wool. Primarily. There are other battings that I've used, but these are the three I'm going to talk about at the moment. So when I'm using something like a synthetic batting, it's usually because I'm making a quilt for a child, a multi-purpose, all-purpose quilt that I don't really know how it's going to be cared for, perhaps if it's for a gift or things like that, where people are likely to just throw it in the washing machine and not worry too much about it. The synthetic battings work really well for that, and of course for children's quilts, because they do often need washing, that works really well for me. And I find the synthetic battings bounce nicely, they quilt nicely. All the battings I use, you'll notice they're all quite thin battings, and that's because I do all my quilting on a sewing machine and just on my domestic sewing machine. So it's got to fit in, it needs to be relatively flat, but I quite like that flat look. You've got to look for things like drapeability, if it's going to hang nicely. It just depends a little bit what you're going to do with it. So there's two types of synthetic that I use. This one here is a fairly lightweight one. I'm not really sure what the weights and things are. I'm sorry, I can't give you those details. This is an inexpensive batting. It's great for, as I said, a lot of kids stuff, multi-purpose. And then there's one that is a little bit more expensive. It's got silicone through it, so if you are a hand quilter, this would be a really good option. But it also machine quilts beautifully too. So I'll just quickly show you these couple of quilts that I've got here. Have both been quilted with the synthetic polyester type batting in them. They're just lightweight, but they sit nicely, they wash well, everything about them is kind of nice. They're easy enough to quilt. I can baste them. I usually use safety pins for basting, and it's light enough that I can scrunch it to fit it into my sewing machine. So that works really well. And this one also has been done with a similar, I'm not sure which one's in which nowadays, but this one would have been a synthetic one also. Again, you can see they just sit nicely. There's kind of nothing really about it to be offensive, and because I know that it can be easily looked after in the way of washing, and no allergies, etc. Those sorts of things work quite well. So that's the synthetic, which I really enjoy using. If I'm making something perhaps a little bit more special, I might use wool or cotton, but again, it just depends a little bit. So if I'm going to use something like the cotton or the cotton blend, this one here is a 100% cotton. It's probably an organic one. It's also still got little bits of cotton seed in it, so that's something to be aware of, because you don't want, if you're on a white quilt, for instance, with time, the seeds might start showing through. There's a little bit of oil and stuff in cotton seed, so you have to be a little bit careful of that. So if you're looking for the quilting side of things on cotton batting, cotton is much flatter. It doesn't bounce. It's a very good coverlet thing. It's great for wall hangings if I'm doing things that I want to be flatter, like a wall hanging or a table cover, things like that. I would use cotton. I probably wouldn't use it if I was trying to do some elaborate quilting, because it doesn't bounce up so well. Whilst it's very nice to quilt, it grabs your fabric well, it's great for actually machine quilting, it doesn't bounce if you're trying to really show off your quilting. The ones with a little bit of poly in them, maybe 80% cotton, 20% polyester, have a little bit more bounce in them, and they're great. You can get them in a black, and you can get it in the natural colour. There may be others, but this is what I can get and what I use. So this quilt here that I can show you has been done with a cotton blend. It's 80% cotton, 20% polyester, and you can see that it quilts very nicely, but it's still fairly flat. It doesn't have a lot of bounce in it, but I wasn't looking for a lot of bounce. It drapes nicely, it hangs nicely if it's going on a bed, hangs nicely on a wall. So for me that works really well. So that's the cotton blend. And this quilt that I've got here will have 100% cotton in it, and you can see it's very flat. Again, I actually quite like that flat look. And the other thing with cottons is that they can shrink a little bit. Most of the cotton battings come with some information with them, and quite often they have 3 or 4% shrinkage, which doesn't sound a lot, but if you were doing a large bed, say like a king size, sort of queen king size quilt that might be 100 inches across, 3 or 4% is 3 or 4 inches that it's going to shrink. So you've got a reasonable amount of shrinkage, and what that does is it kind of rumples and it gives you that old quilt look. So if you were looking for something that was that sort of cotton, flatter, rumpled, older quilt look, then cotton is definitely an answer. And if you quilt it all and then wash it, it will just shrink in that little bit. So you have to bear that in mind if you're making a quilt to fit something in particular, that there is going to be a little bit of shrinkage with the cotton. I'm going to leave that quilt there because I'm going to show you in a minute how that works. So actually, while I'm here, the quilt that's hanging up behind me over here, my little grey monkey, as a wall hanging, I've used a cotton blend in that too. And again, it sits, for me, that sits nice and flat. I didn't want it to be all bulky. I didn't want it to be all wafty and light. For a bed quilt, you might want it to be lighter and things, but I would use cotton or a cotton blend most often in a wall hanging. So that's those. And then I'll just chat a little bit about the wool batting. Now, again, wool, with any battings, they come in different thicknesses, different weights, different qualities. I've got 3 different wools here. One's a darker grey wool, which is really nice if you're working on a darker quilt. This is a fairly dense wool batting, nice to quilt, but quite sort of solid feeling. And this wool batting is a lovely light, soft one, which is really nice also to quilt. Now, if I was doing something where I'm doing some more elaborate quilting, where I'm really wanting that quilting design to stand out, I most likely will use wool because it has better bounce to it. I wouldn't necessarily use it if it was going to be something that was going to be washed a lot, or for children, yes, it's very good as long as you know that it's going to be cared for, because wool, of course, is natural fire resistant, so that's a good idea if you're needing something to be careful in those areas. But it can be a little bit unpredictable with washing. Wool can suddenly shrink for no apparent reason. I've heard some nasty little stories of people who've gone to a lot of trouble with a quilt, and then they've washed it, and the batting has just shrunk and spoilt the quilt for them. So just be a little bit aware of that happening. It need not be a problem, but it can be a problem. So you just need to check out some of the instructions and information that come with your batting for that. But because it bounces better, if you look at something like this quilt here that I've done in the cotton, I'm not sure how well you can see that design on that, but there is a design, but it's fairly flat. It's a little bit hard to see. And this is just with what we call a calico. I think it's probably known more widely as a muslin fabric. And this one here I have done on a wool batting. So it's a slightly different design to that, but it's very similar. It's kind of just an all-one whole cloth quilt. And these are both quite old now. They've been sitting around a little while, but you can still see the design popping up really well on the wool batting. So after several years of being used and hanging around, the wool batting has still got its bounce in it. And then I've made a few other things with some wool batting. I've done, I might show you this quilt down here first. This is one that I've stenciled. I was teaching stenciling to quilters, so I thought we better make a quilt. So again, I've used a wool batting because I was going to be quilting fairly extensively with just that soft bit of stenciling paint on the fabric. And again, I made this one some time ago and it's lasted really well. The design, in my opinion, is still standing out quite nicely. So that's quite good. And then just some table runners. Now, often you might want something flat on a table because I've said I would perhaps normally use a cotton or something where I'm wanting it flat. But these I've put wool in because I've been doing some fairly detailed quilting and I wanted that to bounce. Now these are with a linen fabric and you can see that the quilting is standing out nicely, that it's speaking for itself. The fabric is really just the vehicle there for the quilting, and of course the batting is the bit that's actually popping up and making those designs really effective. Even something like this one, I hope you can see all these well on the camera. They're a pleasure to quilt. It's this lovely linen fabric, and you get that nice sort of up and downing thing happening with the wool. So when you are quilting, you remember, even without the washing side of things and the shrinkage, there will be a certain amount of shrinkage as you're creating the valleys and hills and things with your quilting. And this is one last one that I've done again with wool batting and just a soft cotton fabric. you can see that the design is just popping up nicely. So I just thought I'd quickly show you some of why I use what I use, just to give you a bit of an idea, so that if you're making a wall hanging, you want something flat. If you use a synthetic that's really light and airy on the wall, it probably won't hang as well for you. You may have to pop some weights on it to make it sit nice and flat. And if you're making something to drape over a bed, well, that's really a matter of whether you want it to be fancy quilting with a nice wool in it, which is of course nice and warm, although all quilts are pretty warm. Whether it needs to be easy care, in which case synthetic is probably a good answer for that. So I hope that's helped answer some of the questions for you, and thank you.